I therefore call upon Mr. Crow, went on the old town clerk, to John Crow, who was on his feet now and facing the back of the room, realized in a flash the bitter humor, as far as he was concerned, of what had occurred, but his first feeling was one of indescribable relief. He felt like a hunted fox with all the pack on his heels, who unexpectedly finds a hole, and a hole with a second exit. When Mr. Bishop told him he would have to speak, he had had a spasm of sick terror and had come near to flatly refusing. Then he had thought, after all, why not? Geared will probably come in while I'm getting up steam. And there's nothing really to funk in these people. By now it wasn't Gerd who had come, but Philip. I therefore call upon Mr. Crow, the town clerk had said, and some anonymous voice in the crowd of the rear of the hall had cried out, "He's here! Mr. Crow, be here!" And everyone who turned around saw Philip standing there in the leather jacket of a flyer, motionless and with a grim smile on his face. "He's here, sir! Mr. Crow is here, sir!" shouted the second voice. Philip's contemptuous smile changed in nature in a moment. He threw down his leather cap and stepped rapidly down the center aisle towards the platform. The three aldermen, hypnotized by their inherited West Country respect for the richest man in their town, rose from their chairs to welcome him. Mr. Bishop, who still stood by the speaker's table, murmured rather feebly, "I am sure that everyone here will be glad to learn if Mr. Philip Crow has any opinions which he would care," but here his voice was drowned in a resounding and quite unpremeditated salvo of clapping. Every audience, however hurriedly collected, quickly takes to itself a queer identity of its own and becomes a living organism whose reactions are as spontaneous and calculable as those of a single human being. There had naturally arisen a certain obscure feeling against the newly elected mayor for his non-appearance, a feeling that had been fooled and cheated. This was combined with a hearty, conscious sense that Geared, as a man risen from the ranks, demanded less consideration at their hands than the well-known manufacturer. Philip's unpopularity, too, was much more serious with the poorest and the least educated in the town, an element that had hardly represented in a tribunal tonight. Thus, when, encouraged by the applause with which he had greeted, Phillips mounted the platform and advanced to the table, while Mr. Bishop and the three aldermen sat down, there was given to him, in one of those psychological upburstings of feelings to which the crowd organism is subject, a terrific ovation, by far the most spontaneous he had ever received in Glastonbury. It may well be believed that it was the conservative Mr. Weatherwax, excited beyond all measures by the actual appearance of that authority he so greatly admired, who now lifted up his manly voice and shouted loudly, "3 cheers for Mr. Crow!" The uproar that followed was deafening. When silence was at last obtained, Philip leaned forward against the table and made one of the cleverest political speeches of his life. When it was over and Mr. Bishop rose to make a few polite comments, John whispered to Mary, "What a fellow he is! I hate him, but I can't help being, in some odd way, our old Norfolk blood, able to assert itself still, and make these fools sit up a bit." Philip's hard, cold, clear voice was indeed ringing in the ears of everyone present. And so, his final words had run, "The best way to make our town the sort of place we would all be proud of living in is to make it independent of these precious visitors from Europe and America. A living wage for every man who wants to do a good honest day's work is what I am aiming at. Not old fairy tales, but new factories is what I want to see. Not fake miracles, but solid, hard work. Not fancy toys and mystical gibberish, but smoking chimneys and well-filled larders. Let these visitors, when they come to Glastonbury, find in place of vague chatter about Chalice Hill a prosperous, independent community. A community that does not need to beg or dance or sing, as the old song goes, for its supper. A community that can afford to hire its theatrical performances, a community that is too busy and too well employed to have its head turned by crazy preachers and self-appointed popes. It is not contrary to the weakness of human nature to enjoy the spectacle of a crafty blow aimed at an absent adversary, but if it had not been for his audience's obscure sense that their dignity had been outraged by Mr. Geard's non-appearance, Philip's malicious words would not have had the effect they had. He was vociferously applauded as he sat down, and when, after Mr. Bishop's diplomatic closing of the meeting, and after everyone had risen up to sing the very first verse of God Save the King, there was a general feeling of the audience's mind, intensified rather than diminished by the distant thunder, still unaccompanied by a single drop of rain, that a leader who allowed himself to be betrayed into deserting his post at so crucial a time had received no less than his due from this hawk-faced despot in a leather jacket who advocated laborum ad patem rather than any kind of Sisinus as his panacea for the ills of their town. That paragraph right there is one whole fucking sentence. I'd like you to diagram that thing. God damn. Thus, in the crisis cross currents of this eventful April Fool's Day, dominated by clouds without water, Bloody Johnny and his ambiguous grail received a dolorous blow. The title of our chapter, I think, right? Double check. Yep. And that came up before as something. I forget what now. Anyway, he received a dolorous blow from which it appeared possible that neither of them might recover. In that sequence of spiral recurrences, which past events had eternally returning, but with momentous difference, the same psychological situation had been produced at those long varnished, mysterious days. The wistful and audacious Balin wounded the guardians of the Grail in both his thighs with the terrible spear of Longinus. So that's what the dolorous blow was before. Of course! How could I forget? Every person, as that motley audience left the abbot's tribunal, was conscious that something deep had been stirred up, ready to respond to Gurd's of Glastonbury's communication, and that this something had been suppressed by the malice of superficial human nature, played upon by a practiced hand. There was a feeling among them all that went on as if they had stretched out their arms to grasp a golden bow and had been rewarded for their pains with a handful of dust. It was with a queer, vague, irritated sense of uncomfortable remorse that they went home, with the murmur of that strange spring thunder in their ears that brought neither rain nor lightning. And as the night fell on the roof of Glastonbury, it was as if she herself, the historic matrix of all these happenings, had been thwarted and fooled at the critical moment of her mystic response. The generative nerve of her body had descended into her womb, but all to no purpose. Cold and hard and pragmatic, the words of the Norfolk iconoclast had cut off the consummation of her desire. From the forlorn thorn stumps of Tom Chinnock's Terragasti at the foot of Whirl Hill, the effects of this dolorous blow seemed likely to spread out the whole psychic landscape. Let her labor in, let her eat, but let the stone of Merlin remain a stone, and the fountain of blood remain a Chellybeat spring. When Mrs. Geard and her daughters reached Cardiff Villa that night, they found the master of the house seated alone by the fire in the dining room, with a glass of gin and water by his side. Above on the mantelpiece lay, in its accustomed place, the little ornamental matchbox. From the water closet window on the landing above, he had heard the familiar lead piping give itself to the night once more, with its wonted word, "The unessential shall swallow up the essential." The well-worn doormat and the rusty scraper outside his door emanated the same spiritless and domesticated monotony. As all these things had looked before he went to Northwold, so they looked now, when, after extricating himself with characteristic phlegm and obstinate patience from a darkened wookie hole, he had come straight home to his empty house. Now we begin the next chapter. Presently, Chapter King Arthur's Sword. The first hesitating sprouting of chilly, dumb, whitish-green vegetation had forced their way into the clear air and established themselves above ground. The mysteriously released saps and life essences, faint, mute, and fitful, had now risen high enough to fill the cold, stiff stalks and fling a new smoothness and a new resilience on the upward striving curves. The early, perilously sweet blooms, such as those greenish-yellow calyxes of the first daffodils, catching the sprouts and jets of the chilly sunshine from between the wind-tossed clouds, and bowing their wet petals to the green earth under the heavy shoulders of rain, had given place to the fair, sturdier, if less poignant, growths of the latter spring season. Tulips were now out by the edge of most of the Glastonbury lawns, and the heavy waxen towers of the garden hyacinths, purple and pink, and white and blue, had already passed their apogee of inebriating sweetness and were sinking down day by day into their rich death. The more innocent and more childlike scent of lilacs, too, was already on the air, and the renewal of the earth had even advanced far enough for the great drooping spray of the laburnum trees in Mr. Weatherwax's 2 old gardens to be bursting out to delicate buds. Peonies also, those unrestricting, unwithholding orbs of lavish wholesomeness, were now to be seen in many warm parterres, while across the old masonry of the smaller gardens were bright, checked girls flitting in and out of their houses into the sunshine, like moving flowers themselves in their fresh Easter frocks, kept laughing and challenging one another as they heard their familiar sound, came on the southwest wind the mocking cry of the cuckoo. 3 weeks had slipped by since Sam Decker had lain with Nell Zoyland upon their carefully prepared couch by the White Lake waters. 3 fecund weeks. An hour as sweet as honey, an hour as bitter as Kalacunida, had slid down the same fatal slope into everlasting oblivion. Glastonbury had the air, in that halcyon weather, of being some ancient medieval city, enclosed in paradisiac green pastures, a city that Fra Angelico might have painted, giving it a foreground of watercresses and long-legged herons. April was now more than a fortnight old, and late Easter was approaching. On the morning of Maundy Thursday, after one full night with the moon, windless night with the moon, beds with such liquid radiance that ever brittle primrose stalk and ever sap heavy blueball stalk and cast its own particular shadows on wet clay or cold stone, Cordelia Garrett dressed herself like a blue hyacinth, with her plain face quite illuminated by the regenerative stirrings on all sides of her, opened the street door of old Jones's shop, the high street, and plunged boldly into its cluttered and century-mellowed obscurity. Oof, it's a tongue twister. Here, let's see if I can get through this page. The sun was warm upon the high street pavement outside, but a kind of misty eidolon of the sun, a sort of secondary sun, more golden just because it was more dimmed than the first, poured its rich glow, crowded thick with gleaming air motes, upon all the entanglements of bric-a-brac within the shop walls. This secondary sun, more golden than the first, as if number 2's shop had been a forest glade in some fairyland where roots were old chairs and where branches were old copper candlesticks, fell in long screaming rays above the dragon vase and the Pierrot-lidden pepper pot and the red-feathered shuttlecock and the unfashionable croquet mallet and the shaving mug with the Rhine castle upon it, and made a thick, dim, rusty glory, full of pretentious curves and colors and contours, of the piled-up furniture and twisted brasses of the dim place. It was an arcana of the crazy imaginations of an old anonymous craftsman, this shop of number 2. Old Bartholomew Jones was not a modern virtuoso or a sophisticated connoisseur. He was a Glastonbury character, but something deeply instinctive in the man had led him for years and years, for something like half a century in fact, to collect his objects with a personal predilection all his own. A predilection which, while neither very learned nor very aesthetic, had a certain pathos of choice peculiar to itself. The shop was in fact a limbo of the characteristic symbols of the life of former times. Glastonbury here, layer by layer, through the centuries, was revealed in certain significant petrifications, certain frozen gestures of the flowing spirits of life, as if it was caught up, waylaid, turned into silk, satin, brass, iron, wood, leather, silver, china, linen, pictured books, printed books, play utensils, kitchen utensils, timepieces, white decanters, toys, traps, walking sticks, and weapons. It was not an Aladdin's cave for children, and indeed about many of the objects, warming pans and bird cages and fire dogs and so forth, there was something that suggested besotted and miserly old age rather than youth. But it was a treasure trove of the type of imagination that loves its brood, a little sardonically, and unfatuously, perhaps, upon the wayward whims and caprices of the human spirit. I think I mispronounced about half the words in that section. Well, until next time, cheers.